Hi all and welcome to the show. I'm joined today by Bryan Day. Bryan is a musician from Denver who runs Rocky Mountain MRA alongside Aaron Mello. Note, he is here in a personal capacity tonight, not as a representative of Rocky Mountain MRA, although we will have a little discussion about what they do. Bryan and I became Facebook friends quite a long time ago, but we really started talking after I watched a video of his called Ironic Activism, wherein he details how his band Elite for Tria have been targeted by social justice warriors, or one social justice warrior in particular, with spurious defamations, and he managed to get them kicked off a bill. As a former US Marine, a former prison inmate, and a human being who has overcome depression and psychosis, Bryan is a compassionate soul who is only too aware of societal indifference to men's pain. Welcome, Bryan. How are you today?
Hi, how's it going? I'm doing good.
I'm doing well too. So I'd like to start with the Elite for Tria defamation saga. Can you tell us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, so there was a character named Ross Orling from a band called All Out Helter. That's some kind of local punk band in the area, and it looks like they have a habit of getting shows canceled. Basically, I had a show for late July going, and this character who I'd never met or heard of started defaming me on Facebook and getting other bands to pull out of the show, and I guess there's enough sort of misinformation about the MRM in general that he was able to get the other bands to pull out pretty easily. And the other bands are probably pretty far liberal or far leftist. There's definitely a lot of like feminists in the electronic music scene, which is the kind of music we do. And so I'm not surprised that they pulled out, but I'm surprised that this guy came out of nowhere. I think that they're affiliated. I think that he's affiliated with a group that has also been sort of protesting Rocky Mountain MRA's existence whenever we do a public event. So I think it's related.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about what he was saying? I recall, he called you a front for violent misogyny, right?
Yeah, he said that because I had been incarcerated for my crimes, because I had committed crimes in my past, he thought that this represented some kind of nefarious intent on the part of Rocky Mountain MRA or on my band, which I could sort of understand that perspective if you didn't know anything about me, which I guess he doesn't. But it's ironic because my experience as an inmate has brought me sort of the exact opposite sort of intent with the things that I involve myself in, which is that of compassion, understanding, approaching difficult human experiences from a more understanding point of view, more nuanced point of view, and, understanding how trauma and depression and bad life situations can contribute to crime. And I think it overlaps with the MRM quite a bit, especially since men are incarcerated for longer sentences for the same crimes and stuff like that. All the stuff that we're all familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was what I wanted to get on to discussing, actually, because one of the major points that you made in your video was this ironic activism video was when you were talking about your kind of disillusionment with the US prison system and your belief that it needs reform. And so, I wanted to talk to you about what kinds of reform the US prison system needs. Obviously, you just mentioned the disparities in sentencing that men and women face, which is the same in the UK. I get the impression that the US prison system is in need of some substantial more reform than the UK prison system, to be honest, although there are similarities.
Seems that way. Off the top of my head, I think one of the biggest things that could change is just the war on drugs sort of thing that's been going on. It affects a lot of I kind of personify the war on drugs as a war on men because I've known a lot of people in my incarceration experience, cellmates and stuff like that, who have given me anecdotes about how, for instance, their wives, girlfriends, or fiancés, who are often also drug addicts, might be caught with drugs, but not be arrested because they're not viewed with like suspicion of being a drug dealer or some kind of gangster. They are told they need, one anecdote comes to mind. I had a friend whose girlfriend had a bunch of pills in her purse, and there was a cop that happened to be where she was shopping, and he happened to glance and see that she just had all these prescription meds in her purse, and she was a heroin addict of some kind, and this cop just told her, excuse me, miss, I think you need to get some help. Whereas if it had been a guy like maybe, I don't know, like pills sticking out of his back pocket or something, I really doubt the cop would have treated him the same way. And it, it's pretty common knowledge in the U.S., at least with younger generations, that the war on drugs is what's mostly been responsible for the expansion of the mass incarceration system. And then there's just so many people with felonies and who are in the probation system and on the parole system, and there's federal and state, levels where that's going on, and the jail system is also like a city system. And then there's continued discrimination against people who have felonies. There's a book called The New Jim Crow, which kind of lays out an argument that the felony system is actually sort of a remnant, or maybe even like a resurrection of like the Jim Crow system in terms of the effects it has on people who have felonies. It's very similar to the Jim Crow system back in the day.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And I mean, it's also fairly common knowledge, I'd say, with younger people that it's just, it just doesn't work. This punitive kind of action against drugs is not effective, and where people, or states or societies try rehabilitative approaches, they're much more effective in kind of mitigating the damage caused by drugs.
True. Yeah, the damage happens on an individual level, whether it's illegal or not, and there's some evidence that the illegalization has actually caused a spread by making the price of drugs skyrocket and making it more lucrative to sell, which makes people, it makes it more likely that people will be pushed drugs, or I don't know. There's a whole slew of things.
And of course, leaving people with those convictions, which they then struggle to get back to normal life after.
Yeah, for me, the prohibition against alcohol is the perfect model for what was wrong. And, today, obviously, like when I was in prison, I was in the law library every once in a while. And I would read cases that, just hearing the way judges would talk about people who had been accused of, violating prohibition laws was really funny. They were really heavy-handed against the people that either, made alcohol illegally or smuggled it or whatever else. And it's just kind of a weird look into a different time when, I'm sure that every judge on the bench today, regularly drinks alcohol. And it's just kind of funny to read old rulings about, people that broke the prohibition laws and everything.
And of course there's the voting issue as well, which we also have in the UK, which drives me nuts because, from my perspective, I feel like men and women as well who are incarcerated are particularly vulnerable and particularly need a political voice, and also, the feeling of investment and contribution to their society that would come from having that political voice. So that's quite a big issue for me.
Yeah, it's true. In the state where I live, it's you get your voting rights back after you finish your sentence and your parole period. So I haven't completed my parole yet, so I still can't vote. However, my fiance and I kind of, if we differ on who to vote for, we'll just vote. Like this last election, we didn't want to vote for Hillary or Trump, so we voted for the pacifism candidate who probably received like 100 votes throughout the nation, but I thought that was pretty funny.
That's really lovely. So you basically use your girlfriend's vote collaboratively at the moment.
Yeah.
That's so lovely. What a nice relationship you must have.
Yeah, it's cool, and we talk about political stuff a lot. She when I met her, she was more of a feminist, and now she's more of an MRA.
Nice, good work. She sounds like a keeper.
Oh yeah, definitely. We were engaged earlier this year.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
And so about Rocky Mountain MRA, I've had a look at your website, which we'll leave a link to in the description. And I noticed that you run monthly support groups, and you were also at the Denver People's Fair back in June. So can you tell me how they're all going?
Yeah, so our attendance at the People's Fair was we've been around for 2 years, and the first year we decided to do Pride Fest because we wanted to test the waters of where we could share our message at. And our Pride Fest attendance was actually really successful, and a lot of people sort of saw what we were all about and left with a positive view of what we were about. And then we were protested by a group of women wearing all black who were wearing witch hats and veils. And they belong to a group which calls itself We Intend to Cause Havoc, which is an acronym for witch. And so I think that this group is I think they're kind of stalking us, and I think that Ross Sterling is affiliated with them. So I think that it all kind of ties together there. So they ended up filing a lot of complaints, or I'm not really sure what the process is, but I suspect that they had a hand. This isn't proven. This is just me thinking out loud. But I suspect that they had a hand in getting us banned from returning to Pride Fest because that's what ended up happening. Yeah, it was really rough. Well, it wasn't rough, but I mean, it was really unfortunate because we had such a good time the previous year.
Yeah, disappointing, And you've got real, that's an audience who need to hear the message.
I think so. We talked to a lot of people. We talked to a lot of trans people, a lot of homeless people that happened to be there. We talked to a lot of gay and lesbians who were somewhat misinformed about what the MRM is about, and we're not like anti-feminist MRAs. We're sort of like middle of the road. We just want to raise awareness for the issues. But anyway, so. Our being banned from Pride Fest is what led to us attending the People's Fair this year, and so it was similar, although it seemed that there were fewer people in attendance at the People's Fair by maybe an order of 10 or so, like a magnitude of 10. So there were maybe, I don't know, it was a smaller event, less festive, less out of control, Yeah, and the atmosphere was a little less fun, I would say. But it was still successful. We passed out a lot of pamphlets and talked to a lot of people, changed a few minds. I talked about my incarceration experience a lot, and that seemed to be an angle that people hadn't heard before. I think that probably prisoner rights is probably one of the top men's issues, but it's not addressed as much in the MRM, I think, because it probably doesn't show up for a lot of people in their personal lives.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder as well whether it's partly maybe to do with a fear of being associated with these demonized men. That
could be. And I sympathize somewhat with, there's a cultural attitude towards prisoners that's based on the fact that most prisoners, or many of them at least, have committed violent crimes that are pretty serious violations, and I'm sensitive to people's attitudes about prisoners. I don't want to shame people for being afraid of inmates or anything like that. At the same time, there are some realities around incarceration that I think aren't talked about for that reason.
Yeah, but I mean, there's such a difference between how female inmates and male inmates are perceived. When you read anything in the media about a woman who's kind of going through the criminal justice system or has been convicted, so often the articles are going to be packed full of justifications and explanations about what she's been through in her life and what she was struggling with and why she did it, and that's just absent when we talk about men.
Yeah, it seems like with men, you don't have to make as many large logical arguments to determine why they're guilty. Like, people will sort of fill in the gaps on their own. Whereas with women, it's almost like you have to argue why the law exists in the first place, or why punishing criminals matters or whatever. Yeah, in my personal case, I feel that I was affected by the perception that I was dangerous when it came to my sentencing, because my lawyer he was pretty confident I would get a 4-year sentence, and I was satisfied because I felt bad for committing my crime that I felt satisfied that I would do an amount of time that was fair. I thought if it was fair for everybody involved, that's what I wanted to do. And then I ended up getting a 10-year sentence. And I think it's because I didn't realize how hard I had to fight. So I kind of expected,
Wow.
A fair outcome when actually I got I think a heavy-handed outcome. And I think part of that was due to the perception that I was more dangerous than I am.
Gosh. That must have been devastating when you heard that.
Yeah, I think that when you get a sentence that's 6 years longer than you thought you would get, I think you go into denial. You think about, you think about appeals, you think about reconsiderations, and then that sort of keeps you busy for about a year. And then if those get denied, then you start thinking about other things, and then basically you just involve yourself in long-term projects while you're locked up to pass the time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've heard about what's going on in the UK with women's prisons in particular. Have you heard anything about that?
Are you referring to people who are campaigning for the removal of women's prisons altogether?
Well, yeah, successfully. So
okay.
They shut a massive women's prison called Holloway, not too far away from where I am now, actually, and a couple of years ago, I think. And then they were planning to build 2 new prisons, and they scrapped that plan and decided to build instead small kind of community hubs for rehabilitation, where kind of women can go and get treatment and counselling and other kind of services within their communities to help them get back on track, which is a fantastic idea. But meanwhile, there's plans for 4 new men's prisons which are going ahead, super prisons as well. And, this is in a society where here, if men were treated as leniently as women in the criminal justice system, then 5 out of 6 men who are in prison wouldn't be there. So there's a massive gender disparity, and it's such a shame for everybody involved, because there are more effective ways of dealing with a lot of crimes. There are certain crimes that need a prison sentence, absolutely, but in terms of, drugs wise, we could scrap that straight away, and kind of, various petty crimes could be dealt with in a much more effective and humane way. And here we're going that way with women, but not with men.
Yeah, I think that it's weird with the war on drugs, because I know that there's a history of people selling heroin and cocaine at drugstores, and you read novels where Sherlock Holmes was I think a heroin user, and it used to be
opium,
really common.
Yeah.
And I don't think, maybe people got addicted and it affected their lives just as badly, but the drugs were safer, I think, because they were produced with protocols that made them more uniform in consistent, quality, and they were also cheaper because they're able to be produced en masse without the inflation of price that comes with the danger of being caught and everything. And then you end up with sort of boring people selling it, out of drugstores rather than people who are sort of trying to find illegitimate ways of earning money for one reason or another. People who might be inclined to racketeering or prostitution or stuff like that are getting into drugs, and so it kind of taints the whole thing. And that's just a part of it. I mean, the war on drugs is one aspect of it, but the sentencing lengths, the disparities in how crimes are treated when there's a male perpetrator versus a female perpetrator. Also, the family courts, like in the U.S., I'm not sure if it's in every state, but in many states, men are jailed for failure to pay child support, and that puts another strain on the system. And without all those costs, you probably could open up more rehabilitation centers for men too. I think a lot of the problems associated with incarceration are because of the massive scales at which incarceration take place. So, like, if you have, 3,000 inmates, it's kind of hard to deal with all of their mental health issues, all of their personal history issues, all of their trauma and abuse. And there isn't even really a conversation taking place about, personal histories, trauma and abuse with the men that commit these crimes. A lot of them are traumatized themselves, possibly by family, possibly by bullies from their own childhoods, possibly from even the school system itself, possibly from, a lot of people are funneled into drugs because they've been prescribed ADHD medication, which kind of gets them used to the idea of taking drugs. Like when I was in middle school, a lot of the kids that were on ADHD medication were the first ones to get into marijuana and other drugs, just because they were used to taking drugs already.
Interesting. I've never thought of that. While we're on this subject, I'd just like to direct people, I'm going to leave in the description as well a link to the Elite Fortrea 9 Inch Nails cover of Home, and in that there's messages about the prison system, which are an interesting read. So everyone should have a look at that.
Yeah, thanks for plugging that for me.
That's a pleasure. And is there anything you'd like to finish on?
Basically, yeah, I got interested in the MRM due to my experience as a prisoner, as someone who's recovered from depression and psychosis. My depression got so bad that I literally became psychotic, and that factored largely in my crimes. Had there been any kind of MRM at the size that it is now, back when, 10 years ago, I probably, there's a good chance I might have been able to stop the cycle that I was in, because I would have had people to talk to. Back then I didn't have anybody to talk to. Yeah, that's why I kind of got interested in the MRM, because I feel that it could have stopped my own crimes from happening. So that's another reason why that guy's activism is so ironic. His activism reinforces trauma and toxic behavior in a way that will have the effect of more people committing crimes if his values were to be enacted in a large scale, which is very unfortunate.
Yeah, well, the hypocrisy is also notable, because I'm sure, like any good social justice warrior, he believes that he's compassionate and, fighting for the underdogs, but it's just not the case.
It's ironic, too, that he thought that my logo was sinister looking, because his own band name is a reference to Helter Skelter, which was a Charlie Manson daydream about some kind of race war. So it's like, even to apply his own lens to himself, he fails.
Indeed. Well, I wish you the best of luck with everything. Thanks for coming on. It's been great to talk to you.
You too.